Okay, looks like we are live. Hello everyone, and welcome to my second video on my custom position called "What's Your Decision?" So in this custom position, the last video I made was an introduction to the custom position where I showed the main themes and ideas and a couple of sample games. In this video, we're going to be going over the theory that I've developed for this position, which begins with 1 e4. Pawn to e4. That's going to be the theory. This is probably the most intuitive line for this position, as well as on f4. But we're going to go through 1 e4 first, which is called the closed game. This is the most, and again, this is the most intuitive line, and also there's not as much theory in this position, but in some of the other lines, there's going to be a lot of very interesting theory in lines. But there's also some pawn sacrifices that can happen with these lines too. So there could be still some very tactical stuff, but it's a more positional game. So before I go over e4, I'm just going to quickly cover knight d3, which is a very flexible positional line that tends to transpose into 1 e4 variations, but also doesn't really commit to anything, so it's very flexible. So there's not really much actual theory to follow here, but basically sample line, it can go knight d3, black plays c5 to defend b4, white knight e5, there's b5 to stop against knight c4 ideas. White moves a couple of pawns to develop these two pieces, the bishop and the knight, and black develops, white plays e4, d6 pushes the knight to g4, which defends against f6. That's a nice square for the knight. White then goes d5, and yeah, that's kind of a sample of how this game can go with knight e6. I mean, it can be very flexible. But yeah, now we're going to be covering e4, which is the main point of this video. So after e4, which is a closed game, the main line here goes c5 for black, but I'm going to go through these sub variations. So first, let me go through the main line. So for black, black tries to free get their pieces to come out. So they're probably going to play c6 in some future lines. So white plays f4. So this can even transpose to if white starts the game with f4. However, when I go through the f4 theory, which will be probably the next move I go over, I'm going to be going over f4, f5 theory. So it's going to be a bit different. But so knight e6, knight d3. So c6, black's going to get out their pieces. White develops the bishop. Black strikes back in the center. White reinforces it, and black develops the knight to c7. So over here in this position, we can see that there's there. We can see these two squares, the e5 square and the d4 square, are both free for knights to jump into. White can develop the knight. He can get out the bishop. It can get out the bishop. They can also develop their rooks. It's just a really flexible position, and both sides are not right now. They're not going for sacrificing on c3 and f6. They're actually, if anything, they're going to go and reinforce it with the pawns. But eventually, both sides will probably find a sacrifice. So they're first going to focus on improving, developing their pieces. So that's that line. Now I'm going to go over, let's see, c5, f4. So after 1 e4, we have d5. So this is going to be the second line that we're going to look at. So black can play d5 and strike in the center, sort of like the symmetrical move, as this position is diagonally symmetrical. And actually, in this game, white has an interesting move. So the natural move over here would just be to be playing e5 and defending the f6 pawn, but white actually has a better move that doesn't just commit, and it's actually f4. So f4 might look like a blunder first because obviously the e4 pawn is no longer protected and the d5 pawn can just take it. But however, actually black is lost if black takes it. So this is a sort of a gambit by white. Well, I guess I wouldn't call it a gambit because black can't take the pawn and just not be lost. But anyways, I'll show you what happens. So if black takes d takes e4, white has to play f3. And what this f3 move does is that, well, it offers a second pawn, but if black takes it, white is going to recapture with the rook, and then there's nothing going to be protecting c3, so white's going to be able to sacrifice on c3, and white's going to be able to sacrifice on c3 and win the game because they're going to free their queen and bishop. So actually over here the best move for black is to play e3, which declines that pawn on f3 to take it. But after white plays bishop takes e3, white is better, and white is actually winning because if you look at it, white has developed their dark square bishop. They can bring the knight out very easily, and actually the knight is going to go to f2 and then e4. And from e4, it's going to be defending f6, but more importantly, it's attacking c3. So the knight is going to go and sacrifice on c3, and there's not much that black can do. And even if black can do some stuff, notice that these pieces that black has, the knight and bishop as well as the rook, there are several moves from being developed because they'll have to play pawn to c5, and then the second pawn's going to have to go to c6 first. So so black is way behind in development, and white should easily win this. And just to show you, is pawn takes f3. After rook takes f3, this pawn's going to fall. So we're going to go back to this position with 2f4. So now we know that white is not actually really hanging a pawn. So we're going to look at what black can do. So the most so actually, if we look at, I want to show c5 right now because black can kind of like offer the pawn themselves, but this is actually a mistake. So what black is trying to do with c5 is they're trying to offer their d5 pawn and do the exact same thing. So they're trying to do the exact same thing as I was just showing with white, where they can bring their rook in and take on f6. And if this happens, black is completely winning. It's the same thing that I just showed for white. However, the key difference with this position is that white actually has a tactical move, and it's to do with the light squared bishop. So white actually opts to take, and then after c6, instead of taking, or in this case playing d6, which would be the same as we just went over, white has bishop to g4, and what this move does is it attacks black's rook. So and if white just plays rook to c7, then d6 just comes with d6 just comes in after rook d7. White can just take because the rook can't defend itself. And the main idea with sacrificing the pawn is for the rook to be able to take on f6, but if black's rook is lost, then that can't happen, and white is just better. So what we have over here is then the other thing to find is actually in another line I'm going to showing that white can play knight e6, and actually after this move, which seems like a good move because if you take, then black gets their pieces out, so white shouldn't do that. But actually in this sort of position, it's actually the computer, it's very unclear, but the computer kind of shows that after following a bunch of lines that it's a draw. But in my experience playing from this position, it's definitely harder to play for black. But this will be shown to you in a different line, which also transposes to this because I have the analysis on that. So Right, so black doesn't want to play c5 over here. So instead of c5, black can play d4, which is preparing c5 because there won't be a pawn hanging on d5. So white develops a bishop, black blocks with the knight, f3, c5, knight d3, bishop b5, knight hf2, and c6. And you can see from this position that there are ideas for white to play pawn to f5, but white also has to be very careful about knight takes g5. This g5 pawn could be weak. White also, I would say, has the slight edge because of those f5 ideas are more prominent for white because of the pawn reinforcing on e4, and also this e5 square is available for white to bring a knight eventually. So white is a bit more flexible than black in this position, which is to be expected as white had the first move. So they're going to have the very slight advantage in these sort of lines. So that's how that one works. Let's see. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to see. So after e4, we're going to see what happens after knight e6. So knight e6 is a move that threatens to take on g5 and weaken the protection of f6. So in this position, white can defend against that, and after that, white is going to go for e5 as the main line. Actually, in this position, white has another sort of pawn sacrifice with knight d3, which is the main move in this position. And the idea over here is that black, once again, the e4 pawn is not hanging. So if black takes the e4 pawn, in this position, white wins with knight takes b4. So much like we showed before, when the knight goes to d3 or e6, this pawn is being attacked. So if black just takes it, then after knight takes b4, we have king takes b4, and after f3, of course, if black takes, then rook's going to take on f3, and this pawn is going to fall, and the king is probably going to get checkmated because the queen also attacks it. And if black plays something like e3, then after just, well, bishop takes e3 would be natural, but even after rook e1, white can't really do much. So white can play knight to d4, g4 stops knight f5, and after something like c5, rook takes e3, knight b5, and yeah, so after here, knight d4, bishop takes d4, and yeah, so something like this, and white is getting out the queen. So it is lost if black takes that pawn. So going back to our move, so if black knows that, and now so actually d4 over here is a bit of a mistake. So before I cover that, I'm going to go into which move am I going to go into? Oh, okay, so d4 would be the probably the best move here, but it's still like a bit of a it's still not the best move here. That's what I meant. But after this setup, white doesn't really, and black doesn't really want a knight on e6 and a pawn on e5, because I'm going to show you the lines here, and they're not actually all that pleasant for black. So I'm going to first, so actually none of these moves are very good for black. So first I'm going to go over d4, which probably I would say is the best move for black in the position. But however, it allows for white to play f5, and black can't take on g on g5 over here because white can defend it with e5, like it can defend f6 with e5. So there's no ideas like that for black, and this is just better as white's going to play f4, and it's going to have the f3 square for the rook, or even the knight. White's just going to have more space if white can get f5 in. So white is definitely enjoys a more comfortable position over here. So if not d4, and not d takes e4 as that is losing. The other move that can be played, which is kind of what it transposed into the last game. So black can play c5 over here, but after e takes d5, we're back into the line that I was showing. It's the exact same line as a couple of times, but I have my analysis over here. So after e takes d5, we can look, the best move over here for black would be knight to d4, but I'm going to go over c6 first, because you might want to play that thinking that, well, that if white takes on e6, you free up your queen and bishop, so it's a pretty good move. However, after white actually is going to take the knight, and it's going to play knight to e5 over here. So white has just taken. So black has offered a knight for a pawn, and also black's pieces in the corner here, the queen and bishop, are going to get free. However, if you look at this position, white has a pawn on f6 as well as a pawn on h6, and it's both defended by the g5 pawn. So if you look right here, there's not exactly that much room. So actually black's pawn on e6 kind of hinders the development of this bishop, as well as it doesn't allow like space for, like, for example, the rook to go over here and have an open file, and then like the bishop to take the knight over here. And so black, really, there's only one file that's open, which is this file. So there isn't, so the problem is that white's got their pieces free, but there isn't much space for them. So here's how land goes. So black plays b5, which is going to be a common move over here because white is threatening knight to c4, and then after bishop e2, the king's going to be in trouble. So b5, f3, b6, because it has to protect this from the bishop. So black has to play a few protecting moves, and then after knight to g4, white reinforces this pawn, as in lots of variations will actually be like a rook takes pawn move, which what that move kind of does is it'll free up these two files. So it'll free up these two files for black's pieces as the pawn is going to go forward. So you're sacrificing a rook, but you're getting a lot more space, and you're going to be able to use these pieces that you freed. So rook takes f6 or rook takes d3 even after your pieces are freed is actually a common theme in this position. So after knight g4, that kind of stops that. So I'll show a few more moves. So you'll see black actually sacrifices this pawn because black wants to get their bishops free and wants to use the e file, not only the d file. So if black can open up more space because they freed their pieces, that will be good for them. So white takes, bishop takes e5, f takes e5. So white is really reinforcing this f6 pawn and making sure that rook takes f6 is not possible, as well as going to try to close up the e file so black cannot use it. If white can do both these things, then even though black's pieces are freed, white should have enough compensation. You're going to see in this game. So this is just a sample computer line. White is able to develop their pieces, bring their king out, play h4, and yeah. So from this line, I would actually say I've seen some lines in this where it gets drawish, but like the computer here, you can't always trust the computer, but the computer thinks that white is completely winning here. And I would say that white has at least a draw because there's no way that black can break through. There's no way that black can break through like white's really strong pawn structure, as well as all of white's pieces are developed into the center. And just using the d file for black probably won't really be enough. And also, white's pieces are still trapped, and if white is able to free their queen and bishop, then white should be just winning this game. So I would rather have white in this position, which is why if we go all the way back, I would rather, like, I would not recommend this move c6 here, although I think it could be still playable. But the best move over here is going to be knight to d4. So black moves the knight out of the way and into the center. white develops the bishop. And actually over here, so this is actually a really interesting point in the position. Black has this really interesting move, which is instead of playing like rook to d8, which seems like the most intuitive move, Black can ignore that for now and just play bishop to b5. And the thing with this move is that actually, believe it or not, but after the bishop takes c8, which seems like Black has just like blundered the exchange, this is actually losing for white, and I'm going to show you why. So I mean, yeah, losing for white. So who knew that taking the rook with the bishop is actually losing for white? I'm going to show you why. So bishop takes c8, rook takes c8, and now we see. So again, white's king is kind of in danger over here, and they need to do something to block against their king being like attacked. Rook fe one the computer likes over here as well, but c6 for Black just develops their pieces. So actually, c6, d6, bishop takes d6, and actually, yeah, this is just better for Black because Black is going to bring the bishop over here and it's going to sacrifice on h6. So, and after sacrificing on h6, Black's going to get the queen out. Because if white takes back, then the f6 pawn falls, and if white doesn't, then Black can move the bishop back and then play h6 and taking. So that's how that idea wins. But after g4, which is the move that I've analyzed over here, it's quite interesting because Black actually wins with bishop takes d3, which again looks a bit counterintuitive because you're freeing white's pieces. However, after c6, we see that this f4 pawn is being attacked by Black's bishop. So I'm going to draw the arrow. Yeah. And actually, the thing is that if white just defends it, like what would look the logical move would just be g3 to defend this piece, then knight f3 is actually checkmate. So, and if you look at it, white can't really defend that pawn anyway. So, rook ce1 is white's best try. Bishop is going to take on f4. And after a move like rook to e4, Black is actually going to sacrifice on g5 and play knight c7. And this position should be winning for white. So I'm going to show, winning for Black. So even though white's pieces are freed, white has to respond to Black's immediate threats and can't use them. And then Black's going to be able to free their pieces with a better position. As you can see over here, Black has these strong pawns over here, and it's going to take a few moves for white to develop. But Black is going to have immediate attacks on white's weak king. So f4 by white, knight takes d5 now is about to take on f6, but white can kind of delay this for a couple of moves. So what white can do over here is play bishop takes d4, so now defending this square for one move. But then after c takes d4, there's no way for white to defend against f6, and white just retreats. Black frees the queen, and Black is definitely better here, if not winning, because white's king is weaker. Black has easier development, and white doesn't have this white's pawn structure over here around the king. It's not very strong. Meanwhile, black's structure over here with these pawns is strong. So Black should be better over here. So going all the way back, that's why bishop takes c8 is not a good move. So if that's not a good move, here's the best continuation for white. So white plays f3 instead. c6 is played by Black, and now bishop takes c8 is playable. As rook takes c8, bishop takes d4, and you see that this f4 pawn is no longer going to fall. So white can just take the rook, and And white is not like winning here, even though they went up in exchange, because in this position, material is a bit different than in standard chess. So rooks are not normally as like valuable as they are in standard chess because the position is very closed. So this is actually perfectly playable for both sides, and you have to see that that because white played a long time ago e takes d5, white has a bit weaker control over f6, which is black's compensation for being down in exchange. However, let's see. Yeah, so white can play c6 over here, and that's how the line goes. So I'll show you the line again. See if we have. So this is very playable for both sides. Let's see what this is. Yeah, this is the g4, rook fe1 we went over, g3, and yeah. So actually after this variation, that's all I wanted to show you for e4. So we were right to the beginning. What we covered is that after e4, it's more of a positional line where both sides try to develop their pieces and then try to sacrifice on f6 and c3 later. However, there are a lot of different pawn sacrifices that can be made. And most of them so white has a couple, and if black accepts them, white is winning. But if not, both sides just try to develop their pieces in general. There's an idea uh, with the knight on e6 and taking with the pawn. So black can sacrifice the knight for a pawn to free their queen, but white is able to stronghold the position, and I would actually not recommend that, but I think it could still be playable. And also, as you saw in the exchange, the bishop takes c8 line. There's an exchange sacrifice in one of these lines that black can make, and although they're down in exchange, uh, they're sacrificing, like being down in exchange for a more stronghold over f6. And actually, if I just go back to that line for 1 second, where is it? 96. It was after here. Takes and then d4. Yeah. So not bishop f3. Oops, I did not mean to do that. Yeah. So after this line, not bishop takes c8, but after f3. Yeah, so actually in this position, black doesn't actually have to give up the exchange. So c6, well, the computer actually says c6 is the best move here, but let's just quickly look at if black tries to save the rook, what white can do. Knight h f2, and oh, I see why. So the thing is that white's going to bring this knight into e4, and it's going to be able to sacrifice on c3. So actually in this position, white has to play black has to play c6 and give up the exchange. But yeah, this is quite an interesting line actually. It's a very fascinating one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just quickly show a couple of example. I'm going to show one example game. Um, so this game I was playing against an FM actually, and we're just going to show how I was able to win this game by sacrificing pieces to free my queen and bishop. So as we see, I played d4, so we're going kind of into the theory that I just showed in this position. Knight e6, knight f3 was played. I would probably prefer just knight d3 here, as I can play like my opponent can play f3 and get their pieces out, but they chose for knight f3 instead. Rejected that. They brought their rooks to the center, so actually this knight f3 move kind of hindered their development. But I brought my knight in, brought their knight back now. Yeah, so they should have just played knight d3 in the first place, but actually over here you have to be careful when playing f5, because over here knight takes g5 just worked. They could have maybe played it earlier, but playing f5 is an interesting idea. But you have to make sure that knight takes g5 doesn't work for black, and in this case, this is what won me the game, so I was able to take. And then Once I exchanged the bishops, I had this great move, knight to d6 check, which, so if my knight wasn't on b5, maybe it would have worked better playing f5, but after I check, my opponent takes, and I'm able to free my queen, and my bishop's going to come out very soon. So I just take, I play f5 over here to restrict white's movement, bring my pieces to the file. White tries to counteract that, but I just trade. So over here, because I freed my pieces, I'm just going to try to trade down into an endgame. And after I played bishop to d2, white resigned. And actually, if you look in this position, you will see that the computer actually says that this game is drawn. However, the computer doesn't really understand the fact that white's pieces are over here. The bishop and queen are still trapped, so black is actually winning in this game. So black will just use the extra material in order to win the game, or at least the extra material that's freed in order to win the game. So that's kind of just a quick example. So with that being said, it's been over half an hour now, but I just want to say that okay, so this is the E4 line, and in the next video I'm going to be going over some of the other theory, and that's going to be starting with F4. That's probably what I'm going to cover next. And the next theory in this position is quite a bit like tactical and complex. So the E4 line was quite intuitive. There were a couple of different pawn sacrifices and exchange sacrifices and some other interesting things that maybe weren't as intuitive, but a lot of the main lines were just develop your pieces, control the center, and then try to free the pieces. The next theory is going to be a bit more involved, but hopefully you enjoyed. So if you're just starting out with this position, starting with e4 is what I'd recommend, or playing f4 and then e4. But once you've learned some of the other theory, it's quite interesting. So I guess I'll see you guys in the